But we start in the world of Big Ten football and spring games because the big story was focused on Saturday with some of the top contenders in the East. Ohio State hosting its spring game in Columbus. How unbelievable was the weather basically across the Midwest on Saturday for these spring games? It's never this good. Penn State had similar conditions and similar storylines, quarterback competitions there, and one in East Lansing as well. We'll check in on stories at Michigan State and Penn State in just a bit. But we do begin with everything that just went down in Columbus. Our good friend Joshua Perry was on the call for Saturday's spring game at Ohio State. Joshua, welcome in. And first of all, we have to start with the position that everybody's been talking about. C.J. Stroud will soon be either the first or second pick in the NFL draft, so we wonder who his successor will be. Kyle McCord obviously got most of the snaps as Devin Brown recovers from that finger surgery. What is your takeaway from what McCord did?
Well, I think it's difficult, first off, for fans because you want to see Devin Brown out there to get a true window into what the competition looked like. As you mentioned, he was out with an injury, so we didn't get to see that. And ultimately, Kyle McCord got a ton of reps, and I think it's great for his development. Now, I think we have to take what we saw on Saturday with a grain of salt. Why? Because you don't get the full offensive game plan, so the creativity that Ryan Day is known for, Brian Hartline adding to that, we didn't get to see. There were many players who were out of rotation as well, specifically at the wide receiver position. Emeka Buka, Julian Fleming, Xavier Johnson were all out of that game with injury. Marvin Harrison Jr. didn't play very much. And there's an offensive line that they have to work through. And so I think for Kyle McCord, saw some really good things that indicate that he can be a good quarterback. There were also some throws that he's going to look at on tape and wish that he had back. The one thing that I think is going to be imperative for his development, though, is what the offensive line starts to look like. There is a competition going on there. It's going to continue throughout the summer into training camp. And especially when you have a young quarterback, the offensive line has to do their best to protect the guy who's got the football, and they've still got some work to do.
I spoke with Ryan Day, Joshua, about that very topic last week, and he said, listen, anytime you're replacing your starting center and both tackles, that is a big job. How much more of a concern is that today after what we saw on Saturday?
Well, and they're used to having top 3-round picks at those positions too, right? So you have to understand what you're comparing to. Some really good players that left, and I think Ohio State knows that reps are going to be valuable for the guys who are competing there. It's a bit of a concern. It's not a huge concern for me because a lot of development can happen through the summer and in training camp. The offensive line coach, Justin Fry, had a chance to catch up with him on Friday, and he says that he likes the mentality of his group, and these guys are kind of just getting used to playing a ton of reps. He said there's a lot of guys who were in there in rotational situations last year that now actually have to go out and play a full game, and there's an adjustment curve that comes to that as well. So development is going to be key. I think they like the body types that they have in there. They added through the transfer portal this offseason to the offensive line, and now it's just about finding exactly what that lineup's going to look like for the fall.
And if that lineup gives whoever the starting quarterback is time, the main target will be Marvin Harrison Jr. We got to see in person how he can dominate a game. For 3 quarters, he dominated one of the best defenses in the country in that national semifinal against Georgia. What are the expectations going to be like for that young man heading into the 2023 season?
I mean, there's the outside expectations where, folks who cover the game are looking at a guy who's going to be in the Heisman conversation early on, should win the Biletnikoff as the best wide receiver in college football, and is going to be, top 5, top 10 pick in the NFL draft coming up. But he's also got some personal expectations as well, and I think it shows by the way that he works. And we see the videos floating around on social media of Marvin being in there late at night, catching footballs on the jugs machine. They've got this automated jugs machine where you don't even need someone to feed the balls anymore, which is pretty cool, especially for a guy like him. But when I talked to Mickey Marotti, the head strength coach at Ohio State, what he told me is that he had to tell Marv to change the way that he approaches his extra work too. He said, Marvin, you're not allowed to come in here by yourself anymore. You have to bring other guys along. And so what he's done is he's brought some young wide receivers, a guy like Carnell Tate, who just got on campus, who had a pretty good spring game. He's brought him along as well. He's gotten the defensive backs to come and get some work in as well, catching balls in the jugs machines, going through some routes and different breaks. And I think that's where he can have a big impact on this program. So for him, there are personal expectations. And I think for us, there are expectations of what he can be as a player. But I also think that there's an expectation that he needs to help improve the rest of the team. And he's taking that head on.
That's a really interesting take. I want to focus on Brian Hartline. You brought that name up. He's already considered to be very early into his coaching career one of the top assistants in all of college football, one of the top recruiters as well. Now officially titled as the OC. I asked Ryan last week if there was any truth to that conversation about maybe giving away some of the play calling. He said, well, it'd be nice for Brian to do some stuff to allow me to be the quote-unquote CEO, but Ryan admitted that as it gets closer to the season, he gets those juices. He probably wants to be dialed into that offense. What's your sense of how that relationship may change this season?
Well, I think that it's going to be a heavy collaboration, which is what Ohio State needs. And for a long time, it was really Ryan Day who was controlling the offense. And I think they understand that Brian Hartline can bring a really good perspective. And as he develops as a play caller, which is something that is both an art and a science, he can take that on a little bit more. But, there's this idea, right, that Ryan does need to be around other parts of the program. He needs to spend some time with the defense. He needs to spend some time around other position groups. So that's going to happen. But when it comes down to it, and Rick, you mentioned what we saw in the Peach Bowl, I think we got to go back to that. Ryan Day just knows, like, he has that feel. He's a really good play caller, and I think Ohio State understands that they want to have him in that role. It's just a matter of throughout the week when it comes to game planning and prepping the rest of the team, somebody else really needs to be there who can do a lot of that work, and they see Brian Hartline as that type of guy.
So that's an interesting change on the offensive side from the coaching staff perspective. On the defensive side, former colleague of ours, good friend in James Laurinaitis, comes back to where he was a legend on the field for Ohio State. What's his role going to be this year, Joshua?
I mean, I joked around with him because I've never seen so many articles written about a graduate assistant before, but James Laurinaitis has come in and done a great job, not only working with the linebackers, but on the recruiting trail. And so I think that there's a shift defensively, too, to where there's a trust level that James Laurinaitis can handle some of the grunt work when it comes to coaching those linebackers from the GA role. And it gives Jim Knowles the ability to float around to other parts of the defense, too, and specifically that secondary that had some struggles toward the end of the year. And so I think that overall for this program, there's an evolution where the brains, right, Ryan Day and the Jim Knowles need to be valuable in other spots than just what their expertise is. And they're allowing that to happen. So James Laurinaitis, even though he's just a GA, is somebody who's had a big impact on the spring. And when I talked to Jim Knowles, he said it's been good for him, too, because they can play a little bit of good cop, bad cop. Of course, James Laurinaitis playing the good cop, Jim Knowles coming in playing the bad cop. And it's allowed those guys to grow a lot more on the defensive side of the ball because there's new perspective.
Yeah, I can't really see James being the bad cop. Can you?
No, I can't. Not at all.
He's way too nice. Way too nice of a guy. Overall, defensively, Joshua, what kind of jumped out at you watching from the booth, whether it be a player or whether it be a strategy or something that the team was doing differently?
I think two things really jumped out to me. Number one, on the defensive line, I think there's a lot more depth this year, and Ohio State's going to need that. We watched last year and saw a team that really flashed on the defensive line, but I think a lot of us were really waiting for them to take that step and have that consistency that folks saw when, Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa, Chase Young were playing for that defensive line. I think they're getting closer, but they're doing it by providing depth. And a player that stood out there was Kenyatta Jackson. He's one of those bodies that you'd like to build in a lab. And he's a guy who's got really good closing speed, so he's going to have to be a disruptor. Also, Michael Hall Jr., we talked about him last year. He was a flash guy. He played extremely well. I think he needs the consistency to his game. When I flip it to the secondary, which is one of the big questions, I think the cornerback position specifically has gotten much better. Denzel Burke now is looking like the player we saw a little bit earlier on in his career. And I was told that there's been a renewed focus and more energy that he's put into his preparation. He started training with Bradley Roby in his downtime. Bradley Roby, former Ohio State Buckeye, drafted 31st overall to the Denver Broncos, I believe, in 2015. And so he's trying to learn from a first rounder who did it at Ohio State what it takes to be one of the great ones. But underlying in that, and kind of something that people haven't talked about, was Igbinosun, the Ole Miss transfer, coming in at the cornerback position and declaring that he wanted to play right away, has really made guys start to look over their shoulder and say, what can I do to maintain the reps that I believe that I should get? So there is a renewed emphasis on competition in the cornerback room that spilled into the total defense, and I think that's going to help those guys improve tremendously this offseason.
Well, and you really love to see that in the secondary because that Jim Knowles defense and that scheme puts so much responsibility on guys that are on that back end. Listen, you mentioned it. The failures in the back end late in the season. But it wasn't just last season, Joshua. The last couple of years, the issue for this team defensively has been giving up that big play. There is so much experience and so much production now coming back. What's the key for that group to find some way to gel together so that doesn't become an issue again in 2023?
I think a lot of times first year in a defensive system, guys are just trying to figure out where they fit into the picture. They're trying to get lined up. They just want to get guys on the ground. They're not taking that next step to really challenge the football and make those explosive plays that go the other way for the defense. And I think Ohio State's ready to take that next step. Guys are understanding how the full system is supposed to work. They understand that they can't win football games if they played the way that they did a year ago. And so the emphasis to them has really been competitive. They want to challenge everything, and that's a mentality I think works throughout the season. I also mentioned the defensive line, and this is big for the secondary too, because rush and cover work together. And the sack totals that Ohio State had a year ago are not what they want to be. They want to have more sacks, be more disruptive in the backfield. And if the quarterback's laying on his back, guess what he can't do? He can't throw it to a wide receiver that's ready to make a big play. And so I think those two areas have to improve for Ohio State. It's been emphasized, but now we have to see it in the fall.
Man, all they need is number 37 back running the show at linebacker, I think the eligibility, though, I think it's been used up at this point.
Yeah, I think they have exceeded that. They've got some good backers on the roster that ain't even thinking about me right now.
All right, Joshua Perry, we're always thinking about you. Good stuff, my friend. All things Ohio State. We appreciate the info.
Thank you.
All right, Brian Hartline, a big topic of conversation right now, not just because of his expanded role, but because after Saturday's game, late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, he crashed an ATV on his property, tweeted out to everybody that he appreciates their support. He was hospitalized for further evaluation, but told everyone that was concerned, quote, "I am doing well." Penn State's blue-white spring game this past Saturday. All the talk going in was about the quarterbacks. How would Drew Aller look? Would Bo Perbula actually be there to compete against him? Obviously, those great freshman running backs. And lo and behold, Manny Diaz and the defense dominate once again. Diaz talking a lot about the changes he wants to make up front. Those changes looked awfully good as the blue defeats the white 10-0 in the annual spring game this past Saturday at Beaver Stadium. And for much more on that game and what to expect from Penn State this season, we're excited to welcome in Tyler Donahue, Penn State football analyst for 24/7 Sports. Tyler, let me ask this very simple first question. Just how dominant was the defense on Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, 10-0 tells the story pretty well. There were some goal line stands. There weren't a bunch of takeaways, but it was just consistent, strong defense. Depth was a big deal. I mean, we saw that last year for the Nittany Lions under Manny Diaz's direction. From week one on, they were going 20-plus deep with regularity on the defensive side of the football. You didn't have to be a starter to make a major contribution, and I think that was reflected when they split up these teams for some intra-squad action. It didn't really matter whether they were wearing blue or wearing white. There's starter-level quality talent down the depth chart for Penn State's defense, and Manny Diaz has this group humming. You consider where they were last year at this time. He had only added one scholarship player to the roster during his initial semester on campus last spring, and freshman defensive tackle Zane Durant. Now he knows everybody who returned on this roster. It was a very good defense last year for an 11-win team, and they brought in big-time additions like freshman linebacker Tony Rojas, like North Carolina cornerback transfer Storm Duck. So there is a lot brewing for Manny Diaz. We saw that on display in Beaver Stadium, and naturally, young quarterback playing catch-up, and he's seen some live bullets in the form of some of the Big Ten's best defenders on a daily basis during the spring ball.
As good as that defense was, especially later in the year when Diaz kind of got his attitude into those guys and the way he wanted to play, he said, we need more up front. We need more pass rush. We need those guys on the front four to be more disruptive. What did you see from that group on Saturday?
Saw someone who was very disruptive, and sophomore denied Dennis Sutton. He was a five-star prospect coming in, got to campus last summer. The way he described it, it was like, okay, get to campus, get to preseason camp, get to week one, and all of a sudden the season's underway. So for him to be able to have this full year ahead of him, coming off of a 3-sack freshman season in which he burned his red shirt, played in all 13 games as a backup rotational piece, he may not start this season. Chop Robinson was sensational last year after making the move from Maryland. He's certainly going to play a ton as an edge rusher. Adiza Isaac opted to return. Thought maybe he'd take a look at the NFL draft this year. He did not. He is a fifth-year senior. So those might be the two starting defensive ends, but they've got 3 starting caliber, maybe 4 starting caliber guys Denai Sutton, Chop Robinson, to me, project as first-round talent kind of material. And then you look at what Adiza Isaac did last year as the season wore on. He missed all the 2021 campaign with a torn Achilles. Took him a while. I think he became a different player as Big Ten play progressed into the Rose Bowl, where he had a big performance. So a lot brewing up there. And James Franklin has gone on the record just as early as last week saying he feels like this is the deepest group of defensive ends they have had here at Penn State. Big deal when you talk about some of the quarterbacks they'll face, and a big deal when you consider some of the edge rushers that are playing in the NFL right now who used to wear Nittany Lions uniforms.
You brought up a couple of names that I do want to go a little bit more into depth on. Tony Rojas, there's been so much talk about the amount of weight he's put on and how good he has looked as a young guy, as an early enrollee. And you brought up Storm Duck. That secondary returns, even with Jair and Joey gone, that secondary returns a ton of experience, and you bring in an all-ACC caliber player. How deep, how talented is this back seven going to be?
Just about as good as it's been at any point in a decade of James Franklin running the ship here in Penn State. And I think when you evaluate the experience that they have on board, yes, they lost an All-American in Joey Porter Jr., but they've got a preseason All-American stepping up to that number one cornerback role in Kalen King. A guy like Storm Duck, the experience he brought over from North Carolina, second-team All-Conference performer last year. He may not be a starter on this team. Johnny Dixon came by way of a South Carolina transfer a couple of years ago. He has really proven to be a key component for this team. He can play in the slot coverage. He can play outside. So he may be the guy that lines up outside of Kalen King. And then another second-year player to monitor, like Denai Sutton, Cam Miller at cornerback came in as a four-star player, waited his turn a little bit, did burn red shirt while working as a backup last year. He has kind of thrust himself into that mix. And you look at safety, they are legitimately four deep right there. You got recently named team captain Keaton Ellis back as a senior, Jalen Reed, Zakee Wheatley, and then KJ Winston. Wheatley and Winston bring a ton of length. I'm talking elite level wingspans, but Winston's a guy who really flashed in the blue-white spring game. We've heard a lot about him all offseason long, and when you're looking for an emerging star outside of Tony Rojas, it may be KJ Winston, but Rojas, as you referenced, he was the buzz around campus, and it didn't take him long to do that. Got here in January. James Franklin told us in April that he had added 29 pounds to his 6'2" frame. He was sub 200 pounds when he got here. Now he's pushing towards 230 pounds. We knew he had the mental makeup and the athleticism to really put himself in a good spot on a Big Ten practice field. Now he has that extra weight. He's moving around with confidence, and I think even more beyond the physical gains is what we've heard about Rojas through one semester. Not a lot of hesitation, flying around with aggressiveness. They bring back 5 of their top 6 linebackers from last year in terms of defensive game stats, and including a guy who may have All-American potential in Abdul Carter, but they're going to find room for Tony Rojas, and I think Manny Diaz coming out of spring ball is going to put that imagination to work and figure out where the freshman can fit in come this fall.
All right, from a physical specimen on the defensive side to one on the offensive side, Drew Aller stepped in. He looked like an NFL-sized quarterback the very first time you saw him on campus. He grew last year in terms of understanding the game and got so much PT. He's the presumed starter, at least outside of State College. But James Franklin is very safe to say there's a quarterback competition between Drew and Bo Prabula. What are you seeing at the quarterback spot?
When you ask about Drew around here, coaches, teammates are quick to also bring Bo Prabula into that conversation. We have not heard a definitive naming of a starting quarterback, but Drew Aller certainly looked the part of that during the course of the blue-white game in comparison to his competition there, Bo Prabula. Prabula had a bit of a shaky day, and we have to take into account that a lot of what he can do is based on athleticism and legs outside the pocket. That's not really the structure for it in a spring game, but what Drew Aller did overcame, I think, some high emotions, some excitement early on in front of 60,000 plus in Beaver Stadium. And as things went on, you saw him settle in. I love the way he can keep his eyes downfield while facing pressure. He saw a bunch of it. As I've said, Denai Sutton seemed to be like in his peripheral every single time he dropped back in the pocket on Saturday. But Aller's a guy who, one, didn't turn the ball over in 10 game appearances last year. He had 5 total touchdowns, no turnovers in 10 games. But no turnovers in the blue-white game scenario, too. So you're talking about some situations where he was forced out of the pocket or rushed to make decisions. You can't throw the ball up against a defense that is this good, or they will make you pay. And I thought a big takeaway for me was outside of the box score, he didn't put up the 5-touchdown firework performance that maybe some people out there were imagining for the last couple months, but he was very careful with the football. He showed off some of those different abilities, different arm angles, and it's just a different element in terms of arm strength and being able to touch every blade of grass in the field that this Penn State offense has not had under James Franklin. And Drew Aller coming off a freshman season in which he played more than any first-year quarterback at Penn State since Christian Hackenberg in 2013. I think they did a really nice job getting some of that acclimation process for him, despite Sean Clifford being around last year. And now it certainly seems like his show, even if James Franklin's not ready to tell us that's the case just yet.
All right, Tyler, not a lot of questions in the backfield. Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, both back after outstanding freshman seasons. Not a lot of questions outside. Your top two guys are going to be Wallace and Lambert Smith. So what other storylines should we be watching as spring ball wraps up and as everybody starts to focus on the opener in early September?
Yeah, I think maybe the third guy is at both of those positions. Running back, they're bringing in Trey Potts in a matter of weeks now following his graduation from Minnesota. We saw him come to Beaver Stadium last fall as a member of the Golden Gophers backfield. Obviously was the number 2 guy in that backfield, and he's going to have to really accept the number 3 role. But he's a Pennsylvania native, grew up about 60 miles away from this stadium, and he's going to be a really interesting pickup for this team. I think he'll be able to do some things outside of the norm at the running back position, maybe contribute as a special teams returner, but he's going to add a veteran presence there. And you just never know when health could flare up in that backfield. And then the third guy, wide receiver, that's a big question right now because beyond Harrison Wallace and Keandre Lambert-Smith, James Franklin has made it clear is an open competition. Omari Evans is a second-year player, burned his red shirt last year, 5 catches on the season, but he really came to play in the blue-white game, took a step forward in the way that James Franklin phrased it afterwards, led the team with 5 catches, 80 yards. He was the only Nittany Lion to score a touchdown during the blue-white game. Caden Saunders is another second-year player who took a red shirt last year. He was their top-rated receiver signing in the 2022 class. He's starting to match his speed with his performance as a receiver. But the name to know here is Dante Cephas. Make no bones about it. Coming in from Kent State via transfer this summer. He is a guy that they are very excited on campus. They can't say a lot on the record about him right now because he's just a committed transfer prospect. But he's going to come to town, follow Florida State receiver transfer Malik McClain into this room. And I think a lot of people are penciling him in as that third starter. We'll see if that gets set in Penn come late August. But Dante Cephas, a very, very productive player out of the state of Pennsylvania, went to Kent State, 2 tremendous seasons at the group of 5 level, and it's a big leap for him, but there are people around here who think he could ultimately be Drew Aller's number 1 target as the season progresses.
Great stuff from Tyler Donahue of 24/7 Sports as Penn State gets set for its 2023 opener in early September against West Virginia. Tyler, we appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Today's big stat also fueled by Gatorade. As you look at the weekend results inside the Big Ten, Nebraska Red Hot Huskers sweep Northwestern, scored 35 runs in that series. Michigan State, an expected sweep over Western. Rutgers takes 2 out of 3 from Michigan. Iowa scores 18 on Sunday. 6 different players with an extra base hit as the Hawkeyes take 2 out of 3 from Minnesota. Maryland posts a 6th consecutive series win, taking 2 out of 3 from Ohio State. Purdue also wins the series against Penn State, and Indiana has yet to lose a Big Ten series. They dropped the Friday opener against Illinois, but swept Saturday's doubleheader. And so with all that information in mind, it is time for some insight and analysis. That job belongs to this man, Michael Huff, who joins us in studio. Let's start with Indiana, one of the teams considered to be a preseason favorite inside the Big Ten. They've yet to lose a Big Ten series. They take 2 out of 3 from Illinois. What stands out to you right now when you start to look at the Hoosiers as a whole?
Well, I think Jeff Mercer has done what he does so well. He gets some great bats. These guys can swing the stick. And if they get the pitching the way they've gotten to this point, again, winning series, beating teams you're supposed to team, they're putting themselves in a really good position, not just in the Big Ten, sitting in this Big Ten tournament, but for the NCAA and more of a larger look, national look, and an at-large type bid.
And I'm assuming it's safe to say, and we'll have this discussion with a lot of different teams, that Big Ten squads, because of the strength of the conference right now, you're going to have to post a really impressive mark inside the league to get an at-large look if you don't win the tournament.
Yeah, and I think we're already starting to see some separation there. I mean, we know those teams, like you said, that were in that top 6 by the coaches poll preseason. There's a handful of them that are now really starting to say wins and losses are starting to separate. Now, what's going to be important for them is that they need to keep that going. They cannot just take 2 out of 3 against the lower half of the teams. Unfortunately, we know there's a lot of rebuilding going on at Northwestern with the new coach. Same at Ohio State. We know Minnesota's not typically as strong as they've been in the past. Same with Penn State. So when some of these top teams, the Rutgers, the Marylands, the Indianas, they're facing those 4 clubs, they have to be thinking of a sweep, not just taking 2 out of 3.
I'm glad you brought up Rutgers. They were one of the best stories in the country a year ago. Now, there have been some changes and departures. They wrap up a weekend series with Michigan. They take 2 out of 3, and we've become accustomed to Michigan also being in the conversation as of late for not just Big Ten, but at-large invites to the NCAAs. What's going on with these 2 teams right now?
Well, it's really surprising. Both of these teams have put themselves in a really good position at this point. Top half of the Big Ten. Tracy Smith coming back to the Big Ten, taking over a program in Michigan that we know what they've done recently, getting second in the nation, almost winning the whole thing, not just a few years ago. And Rutgers so close to getting to that NCAA tournament, literally a team that probably should have been in for a lot of different reasons. So they brought a lot of people back. A couple of key losses, but they brought a lot of people back. So for Steve Owens, you know there's frustration in the fact that we have most of our lineup back and we haven't been able to win games and series preseason that we should have. Both of them sitting in a pretty good spot for the Big Ten tournament, and this was going to be very interesting. New coach, established program, and Rutgers showed why they were the number 2 preseason pick by taking 2 out of 3.
Iowa has been a really fun team to watch, especially in terms of their pitching the last couple of years. They've been so good on the bump. They take 2 out of 3 this weekend against Minnesota, but this is one of those scenarios, Mike, where you talk about, hey, 2 out of 3 is great inside the Big Ten, but when it comes to the national perspective, that may be a series that you walk away from wondering how we could have taken that 3rd game.
Exactly right. I mean, you start thinking about the fact that I really want to make sure I don't get to 15 losses. I definitely can't get to 20 losses. And this is a ball club in Iowa that right now only has 9 losses. But there are still 2 or 3 of those 9 against clubs that you would like to think they are teams that you should beat. Now, tough to be consistent up north when you're on the road and then you're home. It's cold, it's hot, and the kids can't quite get into a rhythm. But this one against Minnesota, granted they bounced back. We saw what they can do with their bats when they played that doubleheader and won both of those games with all those extra base hits. But they have a pitching staff that is incredible when they're throwing strikes. And this is the only Big Ten team that can truly say, we beat the number 1 ranked LSU Tigers at LSU. And so for those arms, they need to be a little bit more consistent, and the bats just need to stay what they've been doing.
They've scored 10 runs or more in 13 games already this season. That's pretty good stuff when you have that kind of pitching staff to back it up. We've seen Maryland over the last couple of years become a factor nationally, making postseason runs as well. What do you like about the Terps right now? Is there anything you need to see more of over the last 6 weeks of the season?
Well, I love the fact that they seem to have found their rhythm. You know, early on, they played some nationally ranked teams, had a couple good weekends, had a couple bad weekends, especially when they played Vanderbilt, Ole Miss, and Hawaii, went 0-3. If you could have taken that back and gone 2-1, I think we'd have a totally different vibe. But what I like right now is that they're doing it on the bump. I feel like their bullpen is starting to find their roles and feel more comfortable. And the bats that we were expecting, the Luke Schligers of the world, the Matt Shaws of the world, the Nick LaRussas of the world, they now feel like, as I've watched them recently, playing, hitting consistently. And again, when you start to score runs early and then score runs in the middle of the game, your pitching staff can now relax. And if they give up 1 or 2, you know that you still have a 3-4 run lead, and the fact that you're going to probably score late in the game.
Yeah, we'll get more on Shaw as we talk individual players a little bit later in the show. But in terms of the team race, Nebraska actually takes over first place with win percentage after the sweep this weekend against Northwestern. The bats went wild. The pitching is starting to fall into place. It seems like Will Bolt's team is playing its best right now as we start to get into the meat of Big Ten play.
Exactly right. And this is kind of what you want to see as a manager. You want to have your preseason to give a couple different players a couple chances. Your pitching staff, who's going to be really my 3 starters? Who's going to be that 4th guy? Who's going to be long relief? Who do I trust in those high leverage situations? And it seems like, again, like Iowa, like Maryland, like Rutgers, they went out and played a very challenging preseason schedule. did well, not great, but did well enough to get on that national radar. And now they seem to really have found who is going to fit which slots, both batting order-wise, coming off the bench-wise, and pitching-wise, which is so critical and important as we get to these last few weekends and especially into that Big Ten tournament.
Now, lastly, Michigan State went out of conference this weekend. They swept Western Illinois. It's a team you expect to sweep, but they outscored Western 23-3. We had Jake Boss on last week, and so I started to do some deep research. They're hitting, they're pitching, they're fielding. I think this team is the 2023 most pleasant surprise inside the Big Ten right now.
Oh, easily the best surprise of the season. I mean, this is a team that, again, wasn't really in your top six by the coaches because you haven't quite seen things from some of the players. And all of a sudden, I think with Mitch Jebb doing so well, with Farquhar doing so well, with Vredenberg, all of a sudden, the big first baseman finding his stroke, leading the Big Ten and hitting right now, all of a sudden, there's this momentum that, wait a minute, we have a lot of talent here, and we trust each other now. And as we talked about with Maryland, a little bit with Nebraska, do the pitchers all of a sudden breathe a sigh of relief when you see your hitters scoring in the first, second, third innings, and then the fourth, fifth, and sixth, and then the seventh, eighth, ninth, so that you don't feel like I have to only give up 2 or 3 runs for us to win. I can give up 5 or 6 and we can win. And now there's some momentum going on with that club, and it's a great feel-good story right now.
Yeah, they've won close games, they've won blowouts, they've
come from behind.
Walk-offs,
Yes.
come from behinds, all the things you need to do when you get into a postseason tournament, as the Big Ten will have, as they usually do, in late May. Welcome back to Big Ten. Today we discussed spring football at Penn State and Ohio State earlier in the show. Michigan State also concluding its final spring practice this past Saturday. Beautiful weather at Spartan Stadium for what was officially dubbed the Spartan Football Kickoff. Be interesting coming into the fall of 2023. A lot different expectations coming into this year than there were heading into 2022. And for much more on what we saw Saturday in East Lansing, we say hello to our good friend Darian Harris, longtime linebacker at Michigan State, now the director of player relations for the Spartans. Hey, Darian, first of all, I know it was an amazing day. What was your overall takeaway? You were on the call for the game on Saturday in East Lansing.
Yeah, definitely a phenomenal day in East Lansing. We were, joking or not joking, depending on which side you want to look at it, before the game, where Coach Tucker was saying the weather is like that actually 300 days out of the year in East Lansing. So, all these people saying it was like an anomaly, we don't really know what everybody was talking about. But no, the weather was spectacular. The Coach Izzo's legacy race early on before the Spartan football kickoff was amazing. I think he had his biggest turnout by over 1,000 people for that, raising money for, I believe, 12 to 14 charities. So just over day, the atmosphere, the energy, the passion around campus from Spartan Nation was incredible.
Let's dive into the game and the performances of some individual players. A lot of talk about the quarterback competition, and Mel Tucker has made it clear, as much as Peyton Thorne was locked in last year, that competition is open. Both Peyton, Noah Kim got a ton of snaps. What'd you take away from what you saw from those two guys?
Well, I think both of them have had great springs. And again, as you alluded to, Coach Tucker has made it evident that the quarterback position is open, as are all positions on the team. But competition leads to opportunity, which leads to progress and eventually choosing the right guy. So I think both of them are handling it incredibly well. Obviously, Peyton has the experience, the knowledge of the offense, has been out there for some big moments. But every time Noah Kim has been his number's been called upon and gone into game action, good things have happened. That's just the nature of the game of football. If you can't handle competition, you're probably in the wrong line of work. So I've been proud of both of those guys, watching them work day in, day out, improving on their leadership and, ability to galvanize a team. And they're just going to have to continue to progress this summer and into the fall.
Peyton, certainly the known commodity, but Noah Kim made a couple of throws that certainly made you open your eyes on Saturday afternoon. At the running back spot, Darian, we saw last year the impact that Kenneth Walker had a few seasons ago. He was the ultimate eraser with what he could do. That wasn't in place last year. Jalen Berger certainly had some moments, but Mel Tucker and that offensive staff have made it clear they need more out of the run game. How did that shape up on Saturday?
Yeah, I think it was really great for everybody to kind of get a look at some of the new additions that we made in the backfield. Nathan Carter transferring in from UConn, Jaron Mangum transferring in from University of South Florida. thought both those guys showed well. And again, talking about competition leading to opportunity, you see, a more in-tune Jalen Berger as well. Going out there, he had some really tough runs because he knows that, again, just like the quarterback position, any other position, everything's open for competition. So I believe that the running game will be improved. Also with the addition of more offensive linemen, receivers focusing on blocking downfield, tight ends getting in the blocking game as well with some of the additions we've had. Everything, especially from the offensive standpoint, is all about having a cohesive unit. We're going to get better around for each position. That'll lead to the running game, being more open, which leads to the passing game being more open. So as long as everything's clicking and working together, which I think we saw a lot of on Saturday, I'm looking forward to really seeing what the running game is going to be able to do this season.
You mentioned that offensive line. It seems like there are a ton of guys available. Where is that depth right now in comparison to where it's been the last few years?
Definitely night and day. Coach Cap has done an unbelievable job in recruiting, bringing in big bodies, ready-made players that with some development will be key performers for us on the offensive line. Having 19 guys on the offensive line right now on the roster in terms of the depth that brings to the table, it's really important and imperative, especially at that position. So you look at last year, going into the spring, not having enough guys to really run a green and white game. This year, having enough guys, but then, suffering some injuries on the defensive line, albeit minor. You're looking at a little bit of a night and day look there with our offensive line being incredibly deep right now. D-line being deep as well when we get those guys back. But, specifically focus on the offensive line. Nick Samac and J.D. Duplain, two all-conference NFL hopeful guys coming back to school is huge. Spencer Brown at the right tackle position played the most offensive snaps on the team last year. Getting a guy like Keyshawn Blackstock, the number one JUCO tackle out of the portal. And, as Brandon Baldwin as well, who stepped in for Jared Horse last year at left tackle, continues to improve, you're looking at a real robust offensive line with some depth behind those guys.
Yeah, that they can give the quarterback some time. Keon Coleman could be a guy that has an absolute breakout season. Didn't see much of him on Saturday, but a crazy athlete and a guy who maybe has as much upside at the receiver position as anybody. You mentioned the D-line and the fact that right now there are some injuries there. It appears there's going to be a little bit of a revamped D-line look. Of course, Jacoby Windman was so great last year up there, but then moved back to kind of his more natural position as a linebacker late in the year. How does that change what happens in that front seven?
Yeah, we love to have Jacoby as a multiple player for us, but again, his primary and natural position is running our defense from the Mike Backer spot. So we're able to build up the depth on the defensive line, and we're able to rush the passer with the guys that we have, which I firmly believe that we'll be able to do this season. Jacoby can sit back at his linebacker spot and flow as we saw him able to do the latter half of the season when we can let those guys up front from the D-line hunt and eat. So I'm really excited to see those guys go out there and perform, getting guys like Zion Young back from last season, Chris Bogle as well, looking to get healthy and be ready to go for the season. And then, of course, everyone is always asking about transfer guys and guys we've added, Jared Jackson, Tumishe Adeale, and Drake Butler as well. Just looking forward to seeing those guys when they're healthy and ready to go. And, of course, getting big-name players in our freshman class, such as By Joe. Good looking forward to seeing those guys as well. So D-line will be totally fine. We just have to hold some guys out for a couple nicks and bruises, but really, really looking forward to seeing those guys progress as well in the summer and go on in the fall camp.
A lot of talk right now about a young man by the name of Jordan Hall as well, who not just is a guy who is expected to be a productive player right off the jump, but a leader at a really young age. And you look at him, Darian, and he looks like he is a grown man already. What jumps out about Jordan?
Yeah, a lot of things. First and foremost, as you said, his size and stature. I played with a guy by the name of Tawan Jones, and we came in as the same class. We're roommates. And you just looked at this guy from day one, 6'3", 240, and it's like, oh, yeah, he's going to be the one in our class that plays. And sure enough, he was the guy that played as a freshman. I expect to see the same as Jordan Hall. Jordan's coming in, like you said, a ready-made, looks like a Big Ten linebacker, the first three-time captain in IMG program history, and that program obviously has a rich and deep history. And he has come in and proven himself as a leader from day one. He's already a leader on this football team. He's been at every single community service, event and opportunity that I've hosted. Every single time I call on him to do something, he's right there. That's just a testament to him. His mom, is amazing. Mama Hall, as we call her. She's built up quite the fan base also from the Michigan State and Spartan Nation and Spartan Faithful. So those are the guys that you want in your program. And I can't wait to see how his career develops here. And again, Spartan Nation and everybody got a chance to see him in action going sideline to sideline on Saturday.
We know one thing that has to change for this defense, forcing more takeaways at the bottom of the country last year in terms of interceptions forced. So what changes, whether they're schematically or ideologically, do we anticipate seeing in 2023?
Well, the secondary has some guys that played some ball last year. Jaden Mangum's coming back at the safety position. Dylan Tatum as well. Malik Spencer was able to get in there also. So these are young and hungry guys that are not going to be afraid to take chances. Angelo Gross returns as well as a veteran back there. And then getting a coach like Coach Salgado, coming from the NFL, from the Buffalo Bills, who've had a stout defense for the last several years while they're able to make runs in the playoffs. And he's obviously coached some incredibly great players at that level, specifically at the corner position. You think of Tre'Davious White, and then, young guys like Kyer Elam and what he was able to do. And then, of course, at the safety position as well with Jordan Poyer. So we're looking forward to and have seen that already this spring. His coaching style has really adapted well with our guys. And they've made some plays, this spring that we've been able to see on tape and know that we do need to force more turnovers, specifically from the interception standpoint. We've been great in forcing fumbles. Now we got to get takeaways in the air. And these guys are hungry. And, we had Darquez Denard around this spring as well, just kind of hanging out, Thorpe Award winner. He was just telling these guys, hey, take chances. If you know what to do and you're in the right position, if that ball is in the air, it's our ball. And I think for these guys to hear that has been special also. So I'm really looking forward to seeing them take some balls out of the air this year.
All right, Darian, let's finish here. I do want to touch on the mental state. Last year, there were so many expectations. 2021 was so outstanding, and sometimes you're a victim of your own success because so many players moved on. The league got, if anything, tougher, and the same thing was expected, which was maybe not realistic. This year, the team obviously flying a little bit more under the radar. How does that impact the mental approach as you finish up spring and the guys start to look forward to the fall?
Yeah, I definitely think it makes an impact in a positive way. We don't ever want to necessarily, tell and say that, hey, we're underdogs or anything like that. But at the same time, we know that, off of a 5-7 season, the expectations are, at least from the outside, less than it is coming off 11-win season. For us, though, our expectations are always the same. It's to win every single game on our schedule. So from a mental standpoint, we've taken a new approach. We've kind of toned down what we've talked about in terms of mantras and things like that. And we're just focused on being tough, being disciplined, and being selfless. And if we can continue to focus on those three core values, continue to ingrain that into our culture, we're going to be just fine.
Tough, disciplined, and selfless reminds me a lot of a guy like you when you played at Michigan State, and clearly some successful years during your playing days in East Lansing. Hey, Darian, we truly appreciate the time. Enjoy, if there is any such thing as time off for football staff, I hope you enjoy some of it now as you get ready for the fall of 2023.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.